Rocket Labs, founded in 2006, has made giant strides in the world of launching rockets. In 2009, the company became the first private entity in the Southern Hemisphere to reach space after launching the Atira-1 sounding rocket. Since then, the company has managed to win US contracts and has also raised $200 million in funding from investors. But there's one thing that Rocket Labs hasn't been able to do, and that is launching a rocket from US soil. This is even though the company became headquartered in California in 2013. On today's episode of Super Freaky Science, we'll be taking a look at Rocket Labs. We will be exploring why the company hasn't been able to launch rockets from US soil and when the company will be able to do so, or even if it will be able to do so. So, without further ado, let's dive in. What's Rocket Labs? Okay, let's start at the top. What's Rocket Labs, and why should we be concerned about them launching a rocket from US soil? Rocket Labs is a private American aerospace manufacturer and small satellite launch service provided with a wholly owned New Zealand subsidiary. Rocket Labs' first break came when it developed a suborbital rocket-sounding rocket named Atira. The rocket was an enormous success. As expected of such a young company, Rocket Labs didn't launch its first rocket from US soil. Instead, the launch took place off the coast of New Zealand from the private island of Michael Fay, a New Zealand banker and investor in Rocket Labs. Even though the payload of the rocket was not recovered, it was still termed as a success. In 2010, Rocket Labs got yet another big break. It was awarded a US government contract to study low-cost space launchers to place CubeSats, which are small cube-shaped satellites into orbit. This agreement with NASA opened new doors for Rocket Labs, as it ensured the company would be able to use NASA resources like personnel, pieces of equipment and facilities for their launch efforts. Basically, NASA helped Rocket Labs complete a contract that NASA had given Rocket Labs. It was an extremely sweet gig. 3 years later, Rocket Labs decided that it was time for the big move. They would move to America and continue their business from there. This was certainly related to the fact that there are restrictions in place that stop NASA from working too closely with foreign companies. But if Rocket Labs moved to America and carried out operations from inside the States, those regulations would disappear. It was surely not a coincidence that this move coincided with the company receiving a lot of money and investment from American sources. It also coincided with a period of increased US government customership in the company. When one considers that New Zealand, the country that Rocket Labs was founded in, doesn't have a strong space program, it all begins to make sense. When Rocket Labs moved to America, they were moving to satisfy their biggest clients, and they were duly rewarded for that move. That same year, Rocket Labs received funding from Kosawa Ventures, an American venture capital firm. The next year, Bessemer Venture Partners invested in the firm, and the following year, Lockheed Martin, another American venture capital firm, invested in the organization. In 2017, Rocket Labs announced that it managed to raise an additional $75 million in funding from a Series D equity round led by Data Collective. The company continues to raise money, and in 2018 it reported raising about $140 million in a Series E round led by Future Fund. That same year, the company launched its first NASA mission, but wasn't launched from US soil. Instead, the mission, which was composed of CubeSats, was launched from New Zealand's Mahai Peninsula, home of Rocket Labs Launch Complex 1. The rocket was launched through Rocket Labs' Electron vehicle, and it took about 170 pounds of payload into orbit. However, that was just Rocket Labs' first NASA launch. Before that, the company had already reached orbit twice, making NASA launch the third Rocket Labs launch that year. But there's one important thing to learn from the series of launches that Rocket Labs carried out. Despite being in America for over a year, logistics and approvals from NASA meant that Rocket Labs could only possibly launch from New Zealand. that was a problem that needed correcting. Launch Complex 2. Rocket Labs was determined for this state of affairs not to last for too long. That same year, the company announced its plans for Launch Complex 2, its first American launch complex. The complex was billed to be built at the Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. Construction on site was sped up, and by 2019, work on the site was completed. The launch site was very similar to the company's existing Launch Complex 1 in New Zealand. As you'd expect, the site was primarily designed for customers who prefer that their payload is launched from US soil. Additionally, the site would have responsive launch capabilities, making it markedly more dynamic than the launch site in New Zealand. Even Peter Beck, the company's founder, said that the company made sure to make some improvements on the pad, even if the final product was still identical to the original design. What are the improvements added to the launch complex? First off, it has additional features to help support US national security customers. One of those features is improved and increased security architecture. There's also a separate integration facility just down the road that can support multiple rockets. The facility also has multiple separate clean rooms for payload processing. This means that the launch site will be able to handle launches on short notice. Rocket Labs estimates that the site would require about 30 employees from administration to engineering to manage the site. After completing the site, the company announced that the first company to launch from it would be the US Air Force. The force will fly a microsatellite mission called STP-27RM for the Service Space Test Program in the second quarter of 2020. The program was intended to provide flight opportunities for advanced technologies that were seeking demonstrations in space. The complex was designed to be able to launch one rocket a month. Ordinarily, that would mean the complex would be able to support about 12 launches a year. This may look like a low number, but you have to consider the fact that Rocket Labs has never launched more than 6 rockets a year. So, the launch complex was built to almost immediately double their launch capacity. There still needed to be some testing before the pad would be ready to take on rockets. Rocket Labs had to put a rocket on the pad and then carry out all the necessary interface testing between the launch vehicle and the pad. Why was it delayed? As you are already learning at the beginning of this video, the launch from the Launch Complex 2 had not been on schedule. It was originally scheduled for the second quarter of 2020, and here we are, in the penultimate month of the year, and the launch has not occurred yet. So, why? Well, one reason is that the pandemic slowed down preparations for the launch. That probably doesn't come as a shock to anyone because the pandemic slowed pretty much everything down. Despite the pandemic slowing things down, Rocket Labs still managed to test an Electron rocket on the launch pad around April 2020. The company was able to carry out many important tests and concluded that round of testing with a static fire test of the Electron 9's first stage engine. The tests were successful, and Rocket Lab said both rocket and pad performed seamlessly during those tests. After these tests came a series of postponements. Rocket Labs first said that the launch would be in the third quarter of the year, then the fourth quarter, and then next year. The reason for this round of postponements was the need to get the rocket's new Autonomous Flight Termination System, AFTS, certified by NASA. Since NASA was in a bit of a lockdown for most of the year, it was near impossible to get them to certify the system on time. But that's not all. When the certification process started, it took longer than Rocket Labs envisioned, and, to make matters worse, NASA found errors in the code that had been developed by Rocket Lab engineers. This means that the company's engineers had to look through the system, correct whatever errors NASA had found, and then send them back to NASA for certification. And then hope there are no more corrections to make. In any case, Rocket Labs hopes they will be done with this process in the first half of 2021. But will they meet that target, or will they postpone again? We don't know for sure, but we do know that too many postponements can make investors start to lose confidence. That's one thing Rocket Labs won't want. So we bet that they will get it right this time. Well, that's it on Super Freaky Science. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the like and subscribe button for more freaky science content. Goodbye and stay safe.